Hi, everybody. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about, first of all. When I, years and years ago, learned how to do public speaking, you tell people what you're going to tell them, and then you tell it to them, and then you tell them what you told them, kind of a thing. So we're in part one right now. I'm telling you what I'm going to tell you. We're going to cover the topics of defining the concept of remote viewing, because this whole talk is about remote viewing underground UFO bases here on our planet. We need to say, well, what is remote viewing anyway? So we're going to define that, and I'm going to talk about what the process of this thing called remote viewing is. I'm going to show you some examples of what that's all about. And then we're going to go into the U.S. government involvement in remote viewing. And then we're going to find out who the players were in that. I was one of the players. We'll go on to talk about the legacy of someone called Pat Price and the fact that he thought there were UFO bases on the planet, and some doubts that we might have about what he said. Someone walks up to you on the street and says, gee, there's a UFO base under my house. You want to have some level-headed judgment about, is this guy crackers, or does he have some reason to believe him? Has he told you things that are true in the past? Efforts that I made to corroborate the Pat Price UFO data, and then a period of questions. Remote viewing is defined as this process here, and a mental ability to be able to perceive things that are isolated from you, from your normal senses, and this could be isolated from you in time as well. It seems to be a mental activity that people can do, a way of perceiving something with your mental powers alone. Now, I talk about remote viewing in this formalized description, which was formalized by Stanford Research Institute during their research process. Ingo Swann tells me that he kind of brought this out of the New York ASPR and introduced it to the people at Stanford Research Institute, and they kind of bought into it. This is a really good description of what's going on. What they were trying to do is get away from some definition of clairvoyance, crystal ball gazing, something like that, and to get into some sort of meaningful definition that might be neutral and accepted as some sort of a description. And I talk about remote viewing as being a very structured process that had scientific protocols developed over a number of years. The term remote viewing was expressly contrived to describe this protocol-driven, strict process. This process then involves what you see pointed out here. First of all, we're going to isolate the remote viewer from finding out about this data in any other way. If you're going to ask him, describe where Mr. Jones is right now, you're not going to say, let's see, Mr. Jones has gone to lunch, describe where Mr. Jones is now, because you're going to think of all the restaurants where he might have gone to lunch, right? So you're going to isolate the remote viewer, deny him the ability to, am I too close to the speaker? I'm in a hole or something, okay. Deny the remote viewer the ability to know any objective data about the target. Okay, so you isolate him in some way, either by time isolation or by taking him into a room that has no windows where he can't look out the window and see Mr. Jones driving away in his car or anything like that. Provide him with some sort of a prompt, like the words, describe where Mr. Jones is right now, or describe the location in the sealed envelope, or describe the area demarked as 47 degrees north, 27 degrees west. Provide him some sort of a cue or some sort of a trigger. You push his button and say, do it now. The next part of the process is that the remote viewer objectifies in some way his perceptions. To objectify means, in Ingo Swann's definition, to convert from the mental space into objective space by saying and writing. So you want the viewer to objectify his mental perceptions by saying them or writing them or drawing them, to take out of mental space into physical space. After the viewer does this, then the person that works with them, the monitor, sometimes called the monitor, the trainer, the tasker, can ask questions. Well, gee, I see you drew that big building over there. What was behind the big building, kind of thing. So after the viewer objectifies the perceptions, then you kind of ask questions about the perceptions. And you never suggest information to the viewer that he didn't tell you about. You know, you didn't say, next to the big red trash can, what was there? I mean, if he didn't tell you there was a big red trash can, then you don't suggest that there was one there. And then after your questioning and answering and the declarations of the remote viewer, you have a summary prepared. And usually that is, you know, tape recorded and or written out in a narrative of what the summary is. And in a training situation, you provide some sort of feedback. Feedback providing this person with a learning situation. If you were doing what we call local targeting, like was done at SRI originally, where someone would drive out to a mysterious location and the viewer's job was to describe where he went, then you would actually take the remote viewer to that location afterwards and compare his drawings and his descriptions with that area, so that the remote viewer might learn from actually physically being at the place accuracies and inaccuracies of his perception. In a real-world situation where you're using remote viewing for intelligence purposes or to help the police find where the drug dealer is hiding his stash or a missing child is, sometimes you can't provide feedback. I mean, you just can't say, oh, you were really correct. There's the body right there. I mean, what you're looking for is information that this person can provide. So the idea of using this as an operational information gathering tool is different than training, where you would use a feedback kind of situation. Let's look for a moment at some examples of remote viewing. And I'm showing you these examples so that you might learn what kinds of things can be reported through remote viewing, what kinds of inaccuracies are involved in remote viewing. And we need to have a balanced judgment about this, because as we progress, we're going to talk about UFO stuff. And so we want to understand the remote viewing process and how accurate it may be or may not be if we're going to use it against targets that involve UFOs or UFO bases in this case. This exercise was set up as a sealed envelope exercise. The remote viewer is cloistered in a room, and a random number generator generates a specified number, and then you pull an envelope out of the file cabinet marked with that number, leaving the envelope sealed. You lay it on the table in front of the remote viewer and say, describe the location in the picture in the envelope. Describe this location. The remote viewer then objectifies the description, tells you about it, you get to ask some questions, and then provide the summary. Now in this case, this is the drawing that the remote viewer did of this sealed envelope exercise. So you look at that and you see a nice drawing, and you see some notations that have been made. I've printed with the computer the words up there that parallel the writing. So the printed words are actually what it says in the original handwriting of the remote viewer. You look at it and you see, well, maybe it's some sort of a tower, and you think, well, maybe it's a rocket launcher, but he says it's definitely not a gantry. Maybe it's some sort of crane or something. You look at the basic elements of it and say, well, there's something with crisscross beams and guy wires that hold it up. Doesn't know exactly what it is, and of course, you can't expect from a remote viewer, if you're saying to him, describe Mr. Jones' location, the remote viewer is not going to say to you, he's at the corner of 5th and Main having a ham sandwich. Remote viewing does not work that way. The remote viewer might come back and say, I hear traffic noise, I smell city. There's lots of high structures around me, and it's a very noisy place. That's the kinds of descriptions a remote viewer can give you. So let's take a look then at what this actual place was. There's a certain amount of accuracy there. but he did not come out in words and say, this is an oil drilling platform on the plains in Oklahoma, 13 miles south of the town of such and such. That's not the kind of information remote viewing provides. Now, as another example here, let's imagine we're going to use remote viewing to help the police find out where the meeting between the South American drug lord and his distributor is going to be. We have used other police intelligence systems like paid informants and telephone intercepts to find out that there is actually going to be an important meeting, and for the first time we might be able to photograph this drug supplier from South America, and we just need to know where this meeting's going to be. That might be a problem that we could use a remote viewer to tell us where this meeting is going to be. Give him a date and a picture of this person and say, describe his location on this date. And so if the remote viewer came back with a drawing that looked like this, does this tell you where this meeting is going to take place so that we might capture this picture for our police files of this drug supplier? Well, standing alone, it does not. It doesn't come out and say, he's going to be at the corner of 5th and Main and so forth and so on. But if through other information systems we knew that the guy was going to be, say on a telephone intercept, we picked up, well, I'm going to my niece's wedding. After the wedding, I'll meet you at 2 o'clock at the location. Well, you'd use your police sources and find out where does the niece live, where's she getting married. And if I was to tell you this is in Seattle, Washington, would that help? Can you look at this and know where this guy might be in Seattle, Washington? Does anybody have an idea? She says an aquarium, Space Needle, the King Dome, yeah, okay. Let's read some of these things. Does it say anything about being up in the air and rotating? But it is round. The King Dome certainly has a dome-type shape like that. Okay, it turns out it is in fact the aquarium. Let's go back and see what this remote viewer, Joe McMonagle, one of the best remote viewers in the world, said about this. He said it confines plants, bird-like creatures. Well, these bird-like creatures are the fish swimming around in the water, you know. Bird-like creatures. It's a glass dome, greenhouse, very wet, humid, confined, heavy, huge, overbearing. But he did not use the word aquarium. Now, again, I have taken the trouble to show you these examples. These are very good remote viewings. In the way you judge scientifically the quality of a remote viewing, these would score really high. These are really good remote viewings. But we have to be careful about how much information is there and how much value we can get from it. In my past life experience, I got involved with the government's remote viewing program. Back in the early 70s, there was something called Project Scanate. Scanate meant scanning by coordinates. They hadn't kind of invented the word remote viewing so much, so they named this thing Scanate, or scanning by remote viewing. The Scanate mission was to scientifically examine intelligence applications of remote viewing. What was happening here is the CIA had a collection requirement stating that they wanted to know everything that was going on in psychic phenomena around the world, and they found out that there was a lot of funding in the Soviet Union, millions and millions of dollars, mostly from the KGB, done at private and university laboratories. And the mission then of Stanford, being paid by the CIA at that time, was to duplicate that research. It was very hard of an intelligence problem to find out what the results of the Soviet research was. We knew funding channels, we knew who was working there, but to get the actual results of the research was a very difficult problem. So what we did is we tried to duplicate that research at Stanford to find out what the results of such a thing might be. At that time, two of the principal remote viewers were Ingo Swann and Pat Price. Now, there were more, but those are two of the principal ones, especially on something called Project Scanate. I came along in the late 70s when the Army got involved for security concerns looking at this, and we code-named our program Grill Flame. This program was unique and different than the CIA's program at SRI because I was a member at that time of a unit that went out to various military installations to attack them with our intelligence tools. We would photograph them with overhead satellites, we would intercept their telephone conversations, we would intercept their radio communications, and then we would go to the commander of that United States base and say, this is your profile, this is what you look like to the enemy who collects with these tools today, and counsel him on what kinds of things should be done. Well, about that same time, I was reading the reports and the books out of Stanford on remote viewing and pointed out to my commanders we weren't doing anything in the world of remote viewing. We weren't telling these people how to protect themselves from this thing called remote viewing. So as a young lieutenant at that time, my boss turned to me and says, well, Lieutenant, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to fix that problem? After going through lots of briefings and meetings and approvals of appropriate generals and so forth, we set forth a program to train some people to do this thing called remote viewing, to take people that already were employees of the government, screen them, and train them to do this remote viewing so that we might use them in the same way. That is, have them remote view U.S. kinds of systems and present a threat picture saying, if the Soviets are using remote viewers, this is what your installation looks like to them. It was a Army INSCOM and Stanford research relationship at that time. That all started back in 1977 for me. And there I am in my younger days. And I received various military awards for doing such things. I don't think of these as being terribly special. In the military, you're supposed to get a certain amount of awards in a certain time, and when you don't get them is when you're in trouble. So I don't consider these things as being terribly special. So that's kind of who I am and why I'm here. In focusing on Project Skinny, here's a picture of Pat Price, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pat Price in a minute, but this is a very unique kind of a picture here out at Stanford Research Institute, where we have Pat Price, Robert Monroe, and Russell Targ, one of the research scientists at SRI, all in the same place at the same time. It's a real nice little picture. Now, who is this guy named Pat Price? Pat was a fantastic remote viewer. This is what Stansfield Turner said about him. Stansfield Turner was actually quoted as saying this about Pat Price. They had found somebody who could tell them what was going on anywhere in the world through this process of remote viewing. It was a very interesting situation. Pat Price also believed that there were bases, UFO bases, on the planet Earth. Let's talk for a minute about, would you believe anybody that walked up to you and said this? Well, when Pat Price came to Hal Puthoff in 1973 and set a file down on Hal Puthoff's desk and says, you might be interested in these UFO bases, he had a tendency to believe him a little bit more than your average guy because he was able to provide this other information, this other remote viewing information so well. He did such a wonderful job. He had no particular axe to grind. He wasn't looking to be famous. And yet he came in 1973 and put this file on Hal Puthoff's desk saying, you might be interested in these UFO bases. During this time, Hal had been working with Pat Price, but Pat Price had been separately recruited by the CIA to work for them exclusively. They thought a lot of him. He was a wonderful, world-class remote viewer. Is this material valid? Is what we're about to learn real information? Remember how I stressed that the definition of remote viewing involved a very structured protocol. You know, you hide the target in the envelope, or you secret this person away in a room and you deny them access to this. They don't know what they're supposed to be telling you. They must remote view it in order to be successful. First of all, nobody asked Pat Price for this information. This was not done in a controlled kind of environment. The results of this were never reported to any government officials in any way. Hal Puthoff just sat on the information in 1973. what do you do with this stuff anyway? Who do you give it to? This is a cautionary note up front. Did Pat Price make all this up? We don't know. But he had no axe to grind. He had no reason to make it up. And he had been thoroughly tested and provided wonderful remote viewing information on other things. So there's this tendency to believe him, a man with just wonderful credentials. This guy was reputable. You would tend to believe him. This is kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about today and some of the things that he said about these underground UFO bases. He said that they had a primary purpose, and this had to do with something called reinforced BTL implants, transporting of new recruits, and an overall monitoring function. I do not know what BTL implants are. Somebody said Bell Telephone Labs, but I have no idea what BTL implants are. I asked Dr. Putoff, who was the original person to receive this information, if he knew what BTL implants were, and he said he didn't know either. He said that the occupants of these places looked like Homo sapiens, looked like us. He went on further to say that there was a difference in the lungs and the eyes and so forth, but just to the casual observer, they looked like us. He said they had the ability to use thought transfer and can induce instant sleep and can somehow control people's functions through these advanced mental powers here. That's kind of an overview of what was said. We're going to go into some more depth. So where are these places anyways? Where are these 4 bases that he pointed out in 1973? Mount Perdido is in the Pyrenees, and that's between France and Spain, this range of mountains here. This is an interesting place to report where there might be a UFO base. There have been a number of sightings of UFOs around the Pyrenees Mountains, and there's a famous set of caves in the Pyrenees where there are ancient drawings of ancient astronauts, perhaps flying spacecraft and things like that as well. So it's interesting that that came up. Mount Perdido. Perdido means lost, and so when they named that mountain, what is the architecture of naming that? That would be an interesting research project. Did a lot of people get lost there? Looking at that base closer, these are some of the things that were reported by Pat Price about this particular base. He calls them local units, and a propulsion system that looks like, and I put that looks like in italics because it's a comparator. You have to be careful when you deal with remote viewing. When people use similes, metaphors, and comparators, it's like they can't describe it directly, so they use something similar to it. So when he says looks like, we can't say it is artificial electromagnetic field. There are some sort of detectors. They seem to be worried about being discovered. This is the little sketch he provided of a propulsion system. It was 1973 Pat Price remote viewing sketch. Remember the sketches that were produced that I showed you before of the dome and of the derrick, the tower, and so forth and so on, and judge this drawing with that kind of accuracy. This is a picture of one of the local units of UFOs, and it's kind of hard to discern here. Let me see, it's a 3-dimensional kind of drawing here. This is laying down, the saucer shape is laying down, and this is the top dome of it, the crown and the keel down here. He's drawn it as though it was transparent. And he says that from the crown to the keel, the center of this saucer-like device would be 40 feet, and the width of it would be 120 feet. Is that a reasonable size shape? How big is a regular jet airplane? Is it 120 feet long? Or does that sound like a reasonable shape for a UFO? I don't know. Sometimes you hear things that are as big as football fields and stuff like that. I don't know if this is a good shape or size for a UFO. The next location that he talked about in these 4 locations was in what the country is now called Zimbabwe, and Mount Inyangani, which is right over here. This country is at the southern end of Africa here, South Africa here, It's a landlocked country. This has oceanfront, and this has oceanfront over here. And, of course, South Africa's on the tip. So this is a landlocked country, and Mount Inyangani is right over here. There seemed to be kind of a different function to this base, even though all the bases work together. This base looked like it was some sort of a maintenance unit. Parts being welded in a vacuum chamber. Now, again, I'm a really big doubting Thomas here, and it's not because I don't believe in UFOs or remote viewing. I mean, I'm in the business, right? But I don't think these guys flew from, some nebulae 14,000 light years away from now and got a welding torch at Sears and Roebuck. So he seems to be observing something and yet laying on top of it his knowledge of welding. Whether these ships come from other dimensions or other planetary systems in the universe, welding is something that we do locally in our physical world with our physical things. So he might have been looking at something that wasn't exactly welding and yet called it that. Here's some drawings of some things that he saw there, interesting kinds of devices. Somebody said that looks like a Hoover vacuum or something like that. The next site is in Alaska, Mount Hayes in Alaska. Let's see if we can't point it out. I looked up the coordinates on it, and Mount Hayes is probably right there, Mount Hayes in Alaska. About Mount Hayes, Pat Price said that there were similar kinds of security measures. There seemed to be a preoccupation upon the part of the occupants. They did not want to be discovered. Things that they did were not so much menacing or destructive things, but an extreme amount of attention to the idea of not being discovered as to what they were doing. He says he sees an area filled with computer equipment. Now, here's a man who was in his 60s, in the early 70s, and has a technological background of the 50s, and he's labeling this stuff as computers. So he's probably looking at something that he doesn't understand and trying to fit it into a description. Notice how he says there's a section with equipment that look like oscilloscopes. Oscilloscope is a very fancy piece of 1950s equipment. Again, I don't think that these things are extraterrestrial. They're using an oscilloscope they got at Radio Shack. They're looking at, what is an oscilloscope? It's a round screen electronic measurement and detection device. We put the label oscilloscope on that. He was following some of these wires and went from the top of a mountain peak, saw kind of an antenna sort of a thing here. You could rotate this antenna around. And again, they were looking at detecting radio signals of some kind that would indicate that they themselves had been discovered. It's not like they were, making their own radio broadcast or their own Saturday night television show, but they were interested in detecting anything that might reveal that they had been discovered. It sounds a little ominous in some cases here, that they are dispatching people to do unusual things. Let's say we were going to launch some sort of a probe that would look over this area of Alaska carefully. They might interfere with that probe. That sounds kind of ominous in some way. This even sounds a little bit more strong, that they have penetrated or infiltrated our government in some way. Not so much to control our government or our processes or the people, but again to prevent detection in some way. Now, I don't know that there's any evidence of this, but I do know a couple of weird-looking people, that every time I see James Carver on the TV, I think about what Pat Price said, and you wonder about the meaning of what he had to say. I mean, we have bizarre behavior and strange-looking kinds of things, He appears almost human, Mount Zeal. Mount Zeal is down in Australia, in the northern territories of Australia. I'm going to the pointer here so I can point to Mount Zeal right there. Mount Zeo seemed to have even a different kind of a function here. He called it the personnel center. An interesting description to call something a personnel center. He didn't call it the alien center. He called it personnel. They seemed to find different kinds of people from all the different sites here. Something very interesting happened to him while he was there. It was as though they detected his remote viewing presence. Came out and said, oh, they know I'm here. And so he ran off to Melbourne to visit somebody in Melbourne, hoping that if they were able to follow him in some way in his remote viewing mode, that they would be led back to Melbourne and not to his home. It's kind of an interesting sort of a notion, isn't it, that you'd be able to detect someone there in their remote viewing presence. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. I have myself, in working with remote viewers that I've worked in, had some of them report similar kinds of things to me. And if you look at the physics behind it, in any system, in the Schrodinger situation, is the cat dead if you open the box or not? You never know until you open the box. In the Schrodinger equations, the idea is that the physical world depends upon being observed, the observer effect. So if we observe the physical world with remote viewing, the physical world is therefore modified by that observance. And perhaps then it might be able to detect when a physical piece of space is being remote viewed because it would change. So he goes back to the site after throwing them off and says there are vehicles here, because there are different kind of IDs on the unit. And Mount Zeo has personnel for all the bases. He says that we ought to approach this area with caution, again, because he was detected there and because these folks seem to be very, very concerned about being detected. So we ought to approach those with caution. Now, isn't this true that Pat Price told us? Does it make any sense to anybody? I don't know. Certainly it's a fascinating story, not beyond the realm of possibility. Pat Price was a trusted kind of a guy. In the case of the Pyrenees Mountains, it seems to parallel other sightings that happened in the Pyrenees Mountains. Interestingly, in the case of Mount Zeo, last spring, Hal Puthoff said, well, I need to tell you something else about the Australia site. Well, what's that, Hal? And he said, well, back in 1973 when Pat brought me this folder, I happen to know, this is Hal Puthoff talking at this time, I happen to know the CIA station chief down in this area in northern Australia. And so I decided to call him up and ask him what was going on. And he says, and so I called him up and I asked him, I said, hey, is there anything unusual going on down there? And the CIA station chief answered back to Hal Puthoff, no, this is really a dead assignment. There's not much going on here at all. It's just kind of, watching things, making sure everything goes just fine. And other than all those UFOs around Mount Zeo, there's nothing happening down here. So Hal was like, oh, okay. So that's a kind of an interesting sort of a story, again, that I just learned last spring. And Hal didn't say anything more to him or telling him anything more. But here I am. Hal Puthoff passed this folder to me, passed this information to me in the early 80s, after having met each other in 1977, and my job was to put together a cadre of people, a crew of people, remote viewers that could do this remote viewing for the government in this security purposes kind of thing that I told you about. Hal Puthoff and I became friends, and he handed me this pack of information with all this in it. He said, here, you might be interested in this. And so I go home and read it and look at it and explain it to myself, just as I've explained it to you. If there really are underground UFO bases, these 4 sites, are they made of physical matter? Could you actually go there and touch a UFO and walk around one and get into one and so forth and so on? Are they made of this stuff, this physical matter? Do they have some sort of a stealth technology that would prevent us from detecting them? Obviously, we have radar invisible aircraft right now. We have lots of stealth technology that's within our capabilities. We have, special kinds of radio signals that can't even be detected as well. So maybe they have some sort of stealth technology. You could be standing next to one right there and not see it. How about these mental powers? Do they have unusual mental powers? Could they have a nice visit with you, give you a ham sandwich for lunch, and then hypnotize you and say you were never here? So there were problems that I was thinking about, and how can we find out? How can we find out whether or not these four bases really exist? I trust Pat Price, no reason to lie, loyalty, integrity, discretion, morals, and character, wonderful. Nothing to gain by this, a proven remote viewer. I did have something else, another tool at my disposal. Here I was, an intelligence officer with a cadre of highly trained, skilled remote viewers. The ability to perceive beyond the confines of space and time and give me descriptions of things. Part of the training that I put them through was to challenge their perceptual ability. Pretty soon a remote viewer can remote view McDonald's in the bowling alley and the missile base and the submarine building. They can do that. And you begin to say, what are the limits of this remote viewing? Let's make them flex their muscles a little bit. Let's challenge this perceptual venue and develop individualized skills within the remote viewers. So we developed a package of training targets that would challenge them. Under this authority, then, to train people in challenging targets and to identify individual skills, test the accuracy of these skills, develop people that could look at things. For example, some of the remote viewers could be used really well against nuclear targets. They always knew when there was a nuclear power plant or nuclear weapons facility. They could tell when it was there. Others didn't seem to be able to detect the nuclear component at all. So there were ways to train and ways to test remote viewers in their own individual skills. Under this authority, then, as the operations training officer, in the early 1980s, I pulled Dr. Putoff's old file out of the drawer and said, well, here are some interesting targets to look at. I wonder what would happen if I used these as targets, as training targets. What kinds of perceptions, how skilled are the remote viewers at these kinds of things? And if they tell me that there's UFO stuff there, then that's going to kind of corroborate what Pat Price had to say. It's not going to be what we might call real-world data. It's not like we hiked up the mountain and took a picture of it. But it is some sort of tendency to kind of corroborate. I wonder what will happen. I put this slide up here because I have another cautionary note here. This particular situation was my doing. There was no CIA, Pentagon kind of tasking to do this. And that's a logical thing to be thinking, because I am now a military officer working in a military secret program using remote viewing, but not all the things I did were tasked by outside agencies. These kind of training things I came up with. None of the information I'm about to share with you was reported in any way to any government official. It was simply a training kind of thing to be done. But it was done under strict protocol. I didn't say to the remote viewers, tell me about the UFO base at Mount Hayes. I did not do that. What I actually did was take a map of Alaska, mark Mount Hayes with an X on it, put that map in a sealed envelope, set that envelope on the table, and say to the remote viewers, describe the location indicated in the sealed envelope. So it was a controlled situation. Joe McMoneagle. How many have heard of Joe McMoneagle? Good. I cannot do justice to Joe McMonagle's remote viewing of Mount Hayes without reading to you his verbatim words. Okay, before I describe the pictures that I drew, I have to make a statement. You have to bear in mind that my descriptions and everything and what they lack, because I can't find a lot. I find a lot of difficulty in describing any of this because I've never, ever seen anything that remotely resembles part of this target. This target is, I've never seen anything like it before. It's not just something you can describe. It's like walking me into a place that I have no familiarity with at all. I mean, I don't even recognize screws and bolts in this thing. It's just completely off the wall as far as the target. So I have nothing to relate to. I have nothing to present as I envisioned it. I asked the question of him, what do you mean by off the wall? It's all brand new. It never existed before. This is a prototype of something, some complete new concept. It's like asking an Aborigine who has never seen an automobile to crawl inside an automobile and then describe in his terms what an automobile is when he has no vocabulary, no terms for screws and bolts and seat covers and windows and glass and metal. Even the most rudimentary parts of this thing have no terms for them. Now that's kind of the position I'm in. I have seen something and I don't have the rudimentary terms to describe it. I believe that the target is placed deep inside this mountain range in this desolate area, and that it's virtually almost impossible to discover its exact location. It was put there with great deliberation. Notice that the drawing here, I was amazed when I compared this with a drawing of Alaska. This is water down here, ice up above, a desolate area out here, mountains. Remember the map of Alaska that I put up there before? That's kind of an interesting what Alaska is from a remote viewer's perspective. Now, he went on to say, I perceived underground tubes feeding into some tunnels, small ball-shaped objects that are very large and deep and round. This whole thing is underground and powered by something like an atomic power plant. I don't get the feeling an aggressive nature to this target. I get a defensive nature to the target. I don't sense the presence of individuals at the target. I almost get a feeling this is just put there, sealed off. This is really strange. It was like a great deal of care was used in putting it there very secretively. I get one of those Star Wars feelings. Joe went on to draw some kinds of protective shell or intercept kind of radio sorts of things. If you ask Joe McMonagle today, hey, do you remember the Alaska site? He will say, gee, that seemed more like some sort of a radio intercept site or some sort of a place NSA would put something up there. I don't remember anything about UFOs. So here we have a kind of interesting dilemma. Mel Riley's summary, site appears to be a structure located within a mountain, which is a triangular peak. There's a large lake at the base of this mountain, which is surrounded by high, rugged mountains or cliffs. Seems fairly impenetrable. There were two people walking around outside of the structure and two people inside of the structure. One of the people inside the structure sat at a circular position which appeared to look similar to an organ because of keys, buttons, and switches. The word observing comes to mind, and there appeared to be some sort of screen or monitor, but I couldn't make it out clearly. When I saw this drawing from Mel Riley, it made me think of the oscilloscope description given by Pat Price, this idea of some sort of a round sort of a screen that you might look into to detect signals in some way. So let's summarize. Going back to the Pat Price data, remember that nobody asked Pat Price to provide this data. His descriptions were not controlled. There weren't sealed envelope kinds of exercises or anything else. He just showed up with this information. But they do describe 4 subterranean locations. He, in general, says that they are highly protected from discovery. They seem to know about each other, and they support each other. The purpose of them is to do something with BTL implants, transport of new recruits, and an overall monitoring function. 1973 information, unsolicited, provided by Pat Price. How about information provided by highly trained remote viewers, done under appropriate protocols where they didn't know what they were supposed to describe? Now, I've only shown you 2 of the sites because of time, but I use remote viewers to go back and look at all of the sites. There seems to be a confirmation that there is at least some sort of a very high technology something going on at these 4 locations. The later sites describe these as being protected, mutually supported, and very high technology, very similar to what Pat Price said. The purpose of these sites is observation, perhaps navigation. The sites might not always be occupied. You know, when Pat Price was there was 73, there seemed to be a lot of activity, and you had to watch out, and so forth and so on. Detection by the 1980 remote viewers reported that sometimes they weren't occupied. So it's entirely possible that some sort of extraterrestrial civilization checks in every now and then, but they aren't a 24/7 kind of a crew, you know, they aren't there all the time. That's a possibility. Now, the last thing here is one of the remote viewers reported that there were more of these bases and some on the seabed. That was Phil McMonigle, who just kind of threw that in. He said, you know, there's a lot more of these, and there's some on the seabed, too. Well, there have been a lot of UFO data reported about seeing craft fly into the ocean, fly into lakes, and so forth and so on. So that might be possible, too. Yes, this is time for questions, so if you have any questions, and I hope you do, please go to the microphone so that it'll be recorded on the audio tape.
Mr. Atwater, I'd like to add something to what you have been talking about to add additional credence to your presentation. In a world where mainstream science is on one side of the fence and researchers into the paranormal and ufology are on the other side, this whole area of remote viewing is one of the few areas that I know of where the two come together. The 2 laser physicists, Hal Puthoff and Russell Card, published the research that they did at Stanford Research Institute in 2 mainstream publications. One was the IEEE Journal, which is the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, and the other one was in Nature magazine. These were groundbreaking publications. They published the results of the test that they did with Pat Price and with Ingo Swann, without naming them by name. But the diagrams that they did in remote viewing in the Menlo Park area are in the papers. You can go to any engineering library in any university in the United States and find these 2 papers. Also, Hal Puthoff and Russell Card did similar experiments with Uri Geller. And this involved transmutation of elements, dematerialization of things, and that was published in a book called the Geller Papers. And I challenge any of you to look these papers up. I can't cite the names of the papers because it's about 20 words long, but if you go to your library and look up the book Mind Reach, you'll find these 2 papers referenced there.
Thank you for your comment. It was the scientific validity of their research that made it so easy for me to get involved in this military program. I mean, when you bring the research and set it out in front of your bosses, they couldn't deny it. It was there. That's what made it so easy.
Joe McMonigle in Mindtrek did an incredible session on Cydonia, which he says he doesn't know if it's accurate or not, but it's very detailed with pyramids. And Paul Smith, through an email, related one of his remote viewings he did on the moon.
Yes.
Said he came up with very strange structures.
Yes.
What do you know as far as the other remote viewers, as far as sessions on Cydonia, the moon, and what's your personal feeling on the stories about Pat Price still being alive and working for the CIA?
Oh, good question. The questions put forth are very interesting. We have a little time to deal with them. First of all, I know nothing about the operations done against structures on the moon. I know nothing about that. I wasn't involved with that. Number two, the remote viewing of the Mars site with Joe McMoneagle. In the early 80s, we had a classified contract with Robert Monroe to train Joe McMoneagle in deep meditative concentration in an attempt to improve his remote viewing skills. It was a 10-week training program. The amount of dollars is still classified, so I can't tell you that. One of my tasks during that 10-week period of time was to run calibration sessions every week to see how the training was going and see if there was any improvement over time. Dr. Hal Puthoff gave me a list of Mars coordinates that had unusual objects detected. While Joe was at the Monroe Institute, used those targets as one of those calibration situations. The way I actually did it was to write on a 3x5 card. It said, "The planet Mars, 1 million years BC." And I put that 3x5 card in a sealed envelope. And as Joe McMoneagle went into the adjacent room, I put that sealed envelope in Robert Monroe's breast pocket of his jacket. And when Joe said that he was ready to go, I read him a coordinate saying, "Focus your attention on the location in the envelope, describe this coordinate." And he began describing the structures on the planet Mars. This is all documented in Joe's book, Mind Trek. It was a clean, well-run experiment. At one point, Joe said, "Gee, the sun looks funny." And I immediately said, "Turn left and go to the next coordinate." I didn't want him to discover why the sun looked funny to him. He described these structures and an ancient civilization on Mars. The reason that the civilization was destroyed was because of a cataclysmic astronomical event like a comet or an asteroid stripped the atmosphere from the planet and the civilization was wiped out instantly. In probing deeper using remote viewing skills, the people seemed to know that this was about to happen to them and prepared this place in the pyramids so that perhaps some civilization millions of years later would discover that they were still there. Next question, the Pat Price issue. And Pat Price reportedly died in 1975, and there's some question about his death surrounding that time because he was involved with the CIA. I've read what was said what's been said on the website about that, and it tells kind of an interesting story about people being afraid to say certain things. I asked Hal Puthoff years ago, I said, "Tell me about Pat Price." And I said, "Well, tell me about, what you think." And he said, "Well, Pat had told some of his close friends that he thought he was going to be poisoned, and nobody took any notion of it. He supposedly keeled over in a restaurant having a cup of coffee. When his wife went to the hospital, this is Hal Puthoff telling me this story, when his wife went to the hospital to find him and identify the body, the hospital personnel said that, his body has already been claimed and it has been taken to the funeral home. She went to the funeral home and there was something that looked like Pat Price. Hal Puthoff actually went to the funeral and saw a body that looked like Pat Price in the coffin. Nobody ever could identify or find out who were the people who claimed the body and took it to the funeral home. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2, I put Pat Price's picture in a sealed envelope. And during one of these training sessions, asked Joe McMoneagle to describe the location of the person in the sealed envelope. And the first thing Joe said was, "Hey, this guy does just what I do." And I said, "Well, that's interesting, Joe. Describe his location." "Well, he's in a secret underground place in Virginia someplace." If Pat Price were alive today, he'd be in his very late 80s.